Jack took a deep breath as he pulled his car into the familiar driveway of his childhood home. After 5 years working abroad as an architect, the small-town scenery felt both comforting and strange. At 30, he had made a name for himself designing modern buildings in big cities, but family obligations had called him back. His mother had organized a welcome home dinner, and Jack knew most of the family would be there. He was particularly looking forward to seeing his mother's younger sisters, Susan and Karen, who had always been his favorite relatives growing up. The house was exactly as he remembered, the same faded blue paint, the same creaking porch steps. Inside, the smell of home-cooked food and the sound of laughter greeted him. His mother rushed to hug him, then quickly pulled him into the living room where everyone waited. "Look who finally decided to come home," she announced proudly. Jack scanned the room, exchanging greetings with cousins and uncles, until his eyes landed on his aunts. At 45, Susan looked as striking as ever with her short blonde hair and confident posture. Karen, 3 years younger, had the same warm smile he remembered, her brown hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Both women had aged beautifully, their business success giving them an air of sophistication that wasn't there before. "Jack." Susan approached him first, embracing him tightly. He couldn't help noticing how good she smelled, a mix of expensive perfume and something uniquely her. "You've grown up so nicely," she said, holding him at arm's length to look him over. Karen's hug was gentler but lingered a moment longer than necessary. "We've missed you around here," she said softly, her hand resting briefly on his arm. During dinner, Jack found himself seated between his aunts, who asked endless questions about his work and life abroad. He learned they had become successful businesswomen, co-owning a boutique hotel just outside of town. "You should see it, Jack," Karen said proudly. "We've done well, but we know it could be so much more with the right vision." Susan nodded in agreement. "We've been thinking about expanding, adding a new wing with more exclusive amenities." After dinner, as relatives began to leave, Susan pulled Jack aside. "Can we talk to you privately? Karen and I have a business proposition." Jack followed his aunts to the back patio, where they sat with glasses of wine under the starlit sky. "We need your help," Karen began, leaning forward. In the soft outdoor lighting, Jack couldn't help noticing how the top buttons of her blouse had come undone, revealing a hint of cleavage. Susan got straight to the point. "We want to hire you to design an addition to our hotel, something special." "Special how?" Jack asked, intrigued. The sisters exchanged glances before Susan continued. "An adults-only wing, with rooms designed for pleasure." Jack nearly choked on his wine. "You mean like..." "Exactly like that," Karen said, her voice dropping. "Our market research shows there's demand for upscale accommodations catering to couples wanting to explore their fantasies. And we trust you," Susan added, her knee briefly touching his under the table. "You understand aesthetics, comfort, and discretion." Jack's mind raced. This was certainly not what he expected when he came home. "I'm flattered, but..." "We'll pay you well," Susan interrupted. "Very well." Karen reached over, her fingers brushing his hand. "And there could be other benefits too." The look in her eyes made Jack's heart race. Was she suggesting what he thought? "We need someone who understands what makes spaces feel both luxurious and stimulating," Susan said, her voice honey-sweet. As the night air grew cooler around them, Jack realized he was facing the most unexpected proposition of his career. His aunts wanted him to design a pleasure palace, and from the way they were looking at him, that might be just the beginning of what they had in mind. The next morning, Jack woke with his head still spinning from his aunt's proposition. He had agreed to at least look at their hotel, telling himself it was purely professional interest. After a quick breakfast, he drove to the address they had given him. The Oasis Hotel sat on the edge of town, a charming 2-story building surrounded by well-kept gardens. Jack was impressed. Susan and Karen had good taste. The lobby featured elegant furniture and soft lighting that made guests feel immediately welcome. "What do you think?" Susan's voice startled him. She wore a fitted business suit that accentuated her curves, her blonde hair perfectly styled. "It's beautiful," Jack admitted. "You've done amazing work here. Wait until you see what we have planned." Susan led him through the hotel, explaining their vision. Jack tried to focus on the architecture, but found his eyes drifting to the sway of her hips as she walked ahead of him. They entered a conference room where Karen waited with blueprints spread across a large table. She greeted Jack with a warm hug that pressed her body against his for just a moment too long. "I've been working on some preliminary ideas," Karen said, leaning over the table. Her blouse gaped slightly, giving Jack a view he knew he shouldn't be enjoying. "We want each room in the new wing to have a different theme." Jack forced himself to look at the blueprints. "Tell me more about what you're envisioning." For the next hour, they discussed ideas: rooms with special furniture, hidden compartments for toys, one with a stage for those who enjoyed performing. Jack found himself getting caught up in the challenge, sketching possible layouts while trying to ignore the way Susan's hand occasionally brushed against his. "You understand exactly what we want," Karen said, looking impressed. "Not many architects would be so open-minded." "I like unique projects," Jack replied, noticing how Karen's eyes lingered on his hands as he drew. After the meeting, Susan insisted on showing Jack the empty wing where they planned the expansion. They walked through vacant rooms, with Susan describing in explicit detail the activities each space might host. Jack felt his temperature rising as she painted vivid pictures with her words. "This room could have mirrors on the ceiling," she said, standing so close he could feel her breath on his neck. "Imagine the possibilities." Jack tried to maintain his professionalism. The structural supports would need reinforcement for ceiling attachments. Susan laughed, a rich sound that made his pulse quicken. "Always the architect. That's why we need you." Later, Jack met Karen alone for coffee to discuss budget constraints. Unlike Susan's bold approach, Karen was subtle, her touches seeming accidental yet lingering just enough to make him wonder. "Susan can be very forward," Karen confided, her voice low. "I hope she hasn't made you uncomfortable." "Not at all," Jack lied, adjusting his position to hide his reaction to her nearness. Karen smiled knowingly. "Good, because we both want this project to be satisfying for everyone involved." That evening in his hotel room, Jack tried to work on preliminary sketches. His phone buzzed with a message from Susan containing photos of high-end pleasure resorts for inspiration. Some included images of her and Karen modeling posed in various rooms, their expressions suggesting they were very familiar with the amenities. Another message arrived from Karen. "Don't let Susan dominate all your attention. I have ideas of my own to share." Jack stared at his phone, then at his sketches. He had come home expecting a quiet visit with family. Instead, he found himself caught between his two attractive aunts, both seemingly intent on blurring professional boundaries. As he finally drifted to sleep, Jack wondered if he should walk away now, but the thought of working closely with Susan and Karen for the next few weeks sent a thrill through him that had nothing to do with architecture. A week into the project, Jack found himself working late in the hotel's conference room. The designs were coming along well, but he couldn't deny the growing tension between him and his aunts. Every meeting felt charged with unspoken desires, every conversation layered with double meanings. Tonight he was alone, or so he thought. The hotel was quiet as he hunched over his laptop, refining the plans for what they now called the fantasy wing. The sound of the door opening made him look up. Susan stood there, no longer in her business attire but wearing a silk robe that clung to her figure. Her hair was slightly tousled, as if she had just gotten out of bed. "You work too hard," she said, walking toward him with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "You need to relax." Jack swallowed hard. "I should finish these renderings for tomorrow's meeting." "Tomorrow can wait." Susan placed the glasses on the table and poured the wine. The conference room suddenly felt much smaller. She handed him a glass, then sat on the edge of the table beside his laptop, her robe parting slightly to reveal her smooth legs. "Let's test your designs, Jack. Tell me how you envision people using these spaces." Jack took a long drink of wine. "Susan, we shouldn't." "Shouldn't what?" she interrupted, leaning closer. "Discuss the project. That's why you're here." Her perfume clouded his senses as she slid from the table and moved behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders. "You're so tense," she whispered, beginning to massage his neck. Jack knew he should stop her, but her skilled fingers were dissolving his resistance. "This isn't professional," he managed to say. Susan's laugh was low and seductive. "Nothing about this project is conventional, Jack. That's what makes it exciting." Her hands moved lower, under his shirt, her nails lightly scratching his back. Jack closed his eyes, fighting a losing battle with his desire. When her lips touched his neck, the last of his professional boundaries crumbled. He turned in his chair, pulling her onto his lap. Their mouths met in a hungry kiss that had been building since that first night on the patio. Susan's robe fell open, revealing she wore nothing underneath. "I've wanted this since you walked back into town," she breathed against his mouth. They didn't make it out of the conference room. The large table that had held blueprints now supported their bodies as Jack gave in to a week of pent-up desire. Susan was passionate and demanding, guiding him with whispered instructions that made him forget she was his aunt, forget everything except the feel of her beneath him. Afterward, as they lay across the table catching their breath, reality began seeping back. Jack stared at the ceiling, a mixture of satisfaction and guilt washing over him. "Don't overthink it," Susan said, as if reading his mind. She propped herself up on one elbow, tracing patterns on his chest. "We're consenting adults. But we're also family," Jack reminded her. Susan shrugged, untroubled. "Distant enough. And it doesn't have to be complicated unless we make it that way." She rose gracefully, readying her robe. "Consider it research for the project. Now you truly understand what these rooms need to provide." As she leaned down to kiss him one last time, the conference room door opened. They both froze, looking up to see Karen standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable as she took in the scene. "I was wondering where you disappeared to," Karen said to Susan, her voice strangely calm. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "I see you've decided to start testing the facilities without me." Jack scrambled to cover himself, mortified. But Karen wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked with Susan's in some silent communication he couldn't interpret. "You promised we would approach him together," Karen said quietly. Susan smiled, not the least bit apologetic. He needed convincing. Now that bridge is crossed. Jack looked between them, suddenly understanding this wasn't the first time the sisters had shared more than a business. The tension in the conference room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack quickly dressed, his cheeks burning with embarrassment as Karen continued to stare at Susan with a mixture of hurt and anger. "We should talk about this," Karen finally said, her voice steadier than Jack expected. "All three of us. Tonight at my place." Without waiting for a response, she turned and left the room. Susan seemed unfazed, stretching like a satisfied cat. "Don't worry so much," she told Jack, noticing his troubled expression. "Karen's not really angry, she's just upset I went first." Jack drove to Karen's house that evening with his stomach in knots. The modest but elegant home on the outskirts of town was lit up, welcoming yet intimidating. He sat in his car for several minutes, contemplating whether he should just drive away and never look back. Finally, he gathered his courage and knocked on the door. Karen answered, dressed in a simple sundress that somehow made her look both innocent and alluring. The smell of food wafted from inside. "I made dinner," she said, gesturing for him to enter. "I thought we might need something to help this conversation along." In the dining room, Susan was already seated, sipping wine. The table was beautifully set for three, as if this were just a normal family meal. "Sit down, Jack," Susan said, patting the chair between her and Karen's place. "We won't bite. Unless you want us to." Karen shot her sister a look as she brought out a pasta dish. "Let's eat first. Then we can talk like adults." The meal passed in awkward small talk about the hotel project, the weather, anything but what had happened earlier. Jack noticed the sisters refilling his wine glass often. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Jack sat on the couch, with Karen and Susan taking positions on either side of him. "So," Karen began, turning toward him, "I think we should be clear about what's happening here." "I'm so sorry about earlier," Jack blurted out. "It was unprofessional and inappropriate and—" Susan put a finger to his lips. "Stop apologizing for something we'd all wanted." Karen nodded, her hand coming to rest on his knee. "Susan and I have always been unconventional in our relationships. We've shared partners before." Jack's eyes widened. Despite what had happened earlier, hearing it stated so plainly was shocking. "What we're proposing," Susan continued, "is an arrangement. While you're working on the hotel project, the three of us can enjoy each other's company in all ways. No strings attached," Karen added. "When the project is done, so is our arrangement. No one outside this room ever needs to know." Jack's mind reeled at what they were suggesting. But you're my aunts. By marriage only, Susan corrected. No blood relation. And we're all consenting adults. Karen's hand moved slightly higher on his thigh. Think of it as a once-in-a-lifetime experience. How many men get this opportunity? Their closeness on either side of him, the wine clouding his judgment, the memory of Susan's body beneath his, it all made rational thought nearly impossible. What about your relationship with each other? He asked, stalling for time to think. The sisters exchanged a look over his head. We've always been close, Karen said softly, in all ways. To demonstrate, she leaned across Jack and kissed Susan deeply. The sight of them together sent a jolt through Jack's body. When they separated, both women turned their attention to him. This is your decision, Jack, Susan said. We won't force anything, but we want you. Both of us, Karen added, her usually gentle demeanor giving way to something more primal. Jack knew he should walk away. This was crossing so many lines, breaking so many taboos. But as they looked at him expectantly, their bodies warm against his sides, their scents mingling in his head, he found himself nodding slowly. Yes, he said simply. Karen smiled and leaned in to claim his mouth in a kiss far more passionate than he would have expected from her. As her tongue met his, he felt Susan's lips on his neck, her hands already working on his shirt buttons. The three of them sank deeper into the couch, crossing the final boundary together. 2 weeks passed in a blur of work and pleasure. Jack split his time between designing the fantasy wing and exploring newfound intimacies with Susan and Karen. The arrangement was intoxicating, consuming his every waking thought. By day, they maintained professional appearances at the hotel, discussing plans and meeting with contractors. By night, they surrendered to desires that would shock the small town if anyone discovered them. But as the physical relationship deepened, Jack noticed something changing. While Susan remained playful and detached, treating their encounters as pure fun, Karen seemed to be developing deeper feelings. She would linger in his arms afterward, sharing personal stories and asking about his life beyond the hotel project. One evening, Jack was working late in Karen's home office when she brought him tea. Unlike their usual encounters, she simply sat beside him, her presence comforting rather than seductive. You look tired, she said, gently touching the dark circles under his eyes. The contractor needs these revisions by morning, Jack explained, stifling a yawn. Karen studied his face. Susan pushes too hard sometimes, this project and everything else. Jack put down his pencil, sensing this conversation was about more than work. Are you having second thoughts about our arrangement? No, Karen said quickly. But I wonder if you are. The truth was, Jack had started feeling conflicted. The physical pleasures were undeniable, but emotionally he was getting tangled. Karen's tenderness affected him differently than Susan's passionate demands. Sometimes I worry about what happens when the project ends, he admitted. Karen's eyes softened. Does it have to end? Before Jack could respond, they heard the front door open. Susan walked in, dropping shopping bags on the floor. Am I interrupting a private moment? She asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Just discussing the project timeline, Karen said, moving slightly away from Jack. Susan didn't look convinced. Well, I have news. Mom called. She's coming to visit next week to see our progress on the hotel. Jack and Karen exchanged alarmed looks. His mother, their older sister, had no idea about their arrangement. She wants to stay at your place, Jack, Susan continued. Says she misses her boy. The color drained from Jack's face. For how long? A week, maybe more, Susan shrugged. Hope you can keep your hands off us while big sister's watching. After Susan left the room, Karen touched Jack's arm. We'll be careful. She doesn't have to know. But as the days passed, Jack noticed Susan growing increasingly possessive, especially when he and Karen worked together. She would interrupt their meetings, create reasons to pull Jack away, and make pointed comments about Karen's obvious crush. The night before his mother's arrival, Jack stayed late at the hotel, finalizing designs. He was surprised when Karen appeared in his temporary office. Susan's entertaining a contractor tonight, she said, closing the door behind her. I thought we could have some time alone. There was something different in her manner, a vulnerability Jack hadn't seen before. As they made love on his desk, slower and more tender than the frantic encounters with both sisters, Jack realized he was no longer just physically involved with Karen. Afterward, she lay in his arms, tracing patterns on his chest. "I know we agreed this was temporary," she whispered, "but I'm falling for you, Jack." The admission hung in the air between them. Jack's heart raced, knowing he felt the same way but also knowing how complicated that made everything. "What about Susan?" he asked finally. Karen sighed. "Susan doesn't get attached. Never has. But she won't like sharing either. And she's not just your business partner. She's your sister." "Yes," Karen acknowledged, "and tomorrow your mother arrives. Our sister." They dressed in silence, both aware that their arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had expected. As Karen left, she kissed him one last time. "We need to decide what we really want, Jack, before someone gets hurt." Alone in his office, Jack stared at the hotel plans. What had started as an exciting taboo adventure had become a complicated emotional entanglement, and with his mother arriving tomorrow, the stakes were about to get even higher. Jack's mother arrived the next day, bringing with her the warmth and gentle nosiness that mothers are known for. Linda was a softer, older version of her sisters, with the same attentive eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Jack met her at the airport, his stomach tight with guilt and anxiety. "My handsome boy," she said, hugging him tightly, "you look different. Hometown life agrees with you." If she only knew what really had him looking so well, Jack thought as he loaded her bags into his car. The drive to his rented house was filled with catch-up conversation about family members and old friends. He was grateful she didn't ask too many questions about the hotel project. That evening, Susan and Karen had arranged a welcome dinner at an upscale restaurant. Jack arrived with his mother, immediately noticing the tension between the sisters. Susan wore a revealing dress and greeted Jack with a lingering kiss on the cheek. Karen's outfit was more modest, her greeting warm but appropriately familial. "So tell me about this special project," Linda said after they ordered. Susan mentioned something about an adults-only wing. Jack nearly choked on his water. "It's more of a luxury retreat space. For couples. With special amenities," Susan added, her foot finding Jack's under the table. Karen shot her sister a warning look. "Privacy and comfort are our priorities." Throughout dinner, Jack felt trapped in a dangerous game. Susan kept making suggestive comments that flew over Linda's head but made Jack and Karen increasingly uncomfortable. When Susan mentioned how hands-on Jack had been with the design process, complete with a meaningful look, Karen finally snapped. "Could we discuss something else? I'm sure Mom doesn't want to hear every detail about work." Susan's eyes narrowed. "What would you prefer to discuss, Karen? Maybe your private meetings with Jack." Linda looked between her sisters, sensing the undercurrent but misinterpreting it. "Are you two fighting over my son's design ideas? Don't tell me you're making his job difficult." "Not at all," Jack said quickly. "We just have different visions sometimes." "Very different," Susan murmured, sipping her wine. By dessert, the tension was unbearable. When Karen excused herself to the restroom, Susan leaned over to whisper in Jack's ear, "She's getting too attached. Remember our agreement." Linda noticed and frowned slightly. She waited until Susan went to speak with the restaurant manager about the bill before turning to Jack. "Is everything okay? The three of you seem off." Jack avoided her eyes. "Just project stress. We're on a tight deadline." His mother wasn't convinced. "You know, when I was your age, I thought I could hide things from my mother too. I was wrong." Jack's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I'm not sure yet," Linda said carefully, "but I know my sisters, and I'm starting to know that look in your eyes." Before Jack could respond, Karen returned, followed shortly by Susan. The rest of the evening passed in strained politeness. Later that night, as Jack helped his mother settle into his guest room, she sat on the edge of the bed with a serious expression. "Jack, I need to ask you something direct, and I need an honest answer." His mouth went dry. "Of course. Is there something inappropriate happening between you and one of my sisters?" The question hung in the air. Jack considered lying, but the weight of the past weeks was crushing him. "It's complicated," he finally said. Linda closed her eyes briefly. "Which one?" Jack swallowed hard. "Mom, It's Karen, isn't it? I saw how you look at her." The partial truth was easier than the whole truth. Jack nodded slightly. Linda sighed. "I suspected something when Susan called me to visit. She sounded too pleased with herself, like she was planning something. Are you angry? Jack asked, feeling like a teenager instead of a grown man. Disappointed, concerned, confused, yes. But I need time to process this. She reached for her purse and pulled out her phone. I think I'll call your Aunt Susan now. Ask her to pick me up. I should stay with her instead. Panic rose in Jack's chest. Mom, wait. I love you, Jack. But I need to understand what's really happening here, and I think a conversation with my sisters is long overdue. As his mother made the call, Jack knew the careful balance of secrets was about to collapse. The fantasy was ending, and real life, with all its judgments and consequences, was about to begin. The next morning, Jack awoke to an empty house and a text from his mother. Meeting with your aunts. We need to talk later. His stomach twisted with dread as he imagined the conversation happening without him. He tried to distract himself with work, but couldn't focus. Around noon, his phone rang. Karen, can you come to the hotel? Now? Her voice sounded strained. We're in the main conference room. Jack arrived to find all three women sitting around the table. The tension in the room was palpable. His mother's face was composed but tired, as if she hadn't slept. Susan looked defiant, arms crossed over her chest. Karen's eyes were red-rimmed. Sit down, Jack, his mother said calmly. As he took a seat, Linda looked at each of them in turn. I've spent the morning with my sisters, hearing their version of events. Now I want yours. Jack cleared his throat, looking between the three women. I don't know what they've told you. Everything, Susan interrupted. We told her everything. Linda nodded. About the project, about the arrangement, about both of them being involved with you. What I want to know is, what were you thinking? The disappointment in her voice cut deeper than anger would have. Jack stared at his hands. It just happened. It started as something physical, but then you developed real feelings for Karen. Linda finished for him. He looked up, surprised. Yes. Susan made a disgusted sound, which was never part of our agreement. Enough, Susan, Linda said sharply. You're hardly innocent here, using my son to fulfill your fantasies. Both of you should be ashamed. Karen spoke for the first time. I love him, Linda. I didn't expect to, but I do. Jack's heart expanded at her words, even in this terrible situation. Linda turned to him. And you? How do you feel about my sister? I love her, Jack said simply, the truth of it washing through him. I know it's complicated and probably wrong, but I do. An unexpected smile touched Linda's lips. Interesting. The reaction confused Jack. He had expected more anger, more judgment. Linda leaned forward. I've had a lot of time to think since last night. At first, I was horrified, but then I remembered something important. You're not actually related by blood. Susan uncrossed her arms. That's what we said. Be quiet, Susan, Linda said without looking at her. You've done enough. She turned back to Jack and Karen. Karen is not technically your aunt. She became my sister when I married your father, and you were already 5 years old. There's no biological relationship. Jack hadn't thought about it that way before. His father had died years ago, and Linda's sisters had always just been his aunts. The age difference is significant, Linda continued. The power dynamics were inappropriate given your professional relationship, and the deception hurts. But love? She shook her head. I can't condemn love. Susan stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. We had an arrangement. Which is over, Karen said firmly. I'm sorry, Susan. I know this isn't what we planned. Susan glared at them both before storming out of the room. A heavy silence fell. Finally, Linda spoke again. I can't say I'm happy about how this started, but I've watched Karen search for real connection her whole life. And Jack, I've never seen you look at someone the way you look at her. Jack reached for Karen's hand across the table. What happens now? The hotel project will be completed. Linda said practically. Susan will come around eventually. She always does when her temper cools. And you too? She gestured between them. You take things slowly. Date properly. See if what you feel survives outside the secrecy and excitement. Karen's eyes filled with tears. You're not going to make us stop seeing each other. Would it work if I tried? Linda asked with a knowing look. I'd rather you build something honest than sneak around behind my back. But Jack will move out of your house and into his own place immediately. Jack nodded, relief washing through him. We'll do this right. Later that evening, as Jack packed his things from Karen's house, she sat on the bed watching him. Do you think we can make this work? She asked. A real relationship after how we started. Jack sat beside her, taking her hands in his. I never expected my aunts to ask me to design a pleasure palace. I never expected to cross so many lines, and I definitely never expected to fall in love with you. Karen smiled. So many unexpected things. One more unexpected thing, Jack said, kissing her softly. I think we're going to be happy.